Now we come to our regular feature, So Bad It's Good. A lot of poetry out there, of course, is classic, canonical, it's widely read, it remains classic. But there's a lot of poetry out there that remains famous, but maybe for all the wrong reasons, because it is so cack-handed, so incompetent, so tone-deaf. It's actually quite enjoyable to read, and we try to curate some of the best, or is it the worst, examples of this here on the School of Poetry podcast. This week I've been delving into poetasters and potatoes. The links between poetry and the humble spud, not perhaps apparent immediately, although when we think of Dr Oli, the man who, in the popular imagination at least, is credited with introducing the potato to England, was also an accomplished poet. But you have to go, some way, I think, to find another potato-related poet. But by the time we get to the Victorian era, which is where we're back now, we do find one in the shape of Joseph Gwyer, a man who is not as well known as William McGonagall, who's often cited as the worst poet in the English language. But he was similarly deluded on a similar scale, I think, about his accomplishments. He was born in 1835, and by trade he sold potatoes. But his dream, his sideline, if you will, was to become a famous poet who would have royal patronage. So he wrote to Buckingham Palace, much as William McGonagall sought out Queen Victoria and tried to gain her support and her endorsement for his work. He wrote to Buckingham Palace on several occasions, always got polite letters of rejection back, normally from some private secretary or other. I don't think the poem's ever made it as far as Queen Victoria herself. McGonagall himself famously walked from his home in Dundee all the way to Balmoral, some 60 miles there and back, through violent thunderstorms, pouring rain, enduring a night in a barn, so he could have an audience with Queen Victoria and read some of his poems to her. Unfortunately, when he got to Balmoral, he was refused entry and had to walk all the way back again.
And was wet.
And was very wet, yeah. Although he didn't mind, I don't think he minded that. He actually read poems in a circus, McGonagall. And was given something like 15 shillings a night to read his poems and be pelted with rotten vegetables and eggs.
He's really committed to the form.
But he loved that because he thought it was, recognition of his work in some way. And he was very annoyed when the authorities put a stop to it and said, no, you can't do that anymore. Gwyer, similarly, he kept writing to people and he collected the reviews he got, thinking that they were ringing endorsements of his genius, but in fact they were somewhat more measured, shall we say, in their support of his work. For instance, when he published a collection of his work in 1875 under the title Sketches of the Life of Joseph Gwyer, Potato Salesman, with his poems commended by royalty, which is quite a bold claim, that Lloyd's Weekly wrote a review of the volume, which he appended into later editions, that read, Mr. Gwyer's aspirations are most praiseworthy. We prefer to refrain from depreciating that which is so well intentioned, which is, very, very quiet praise at best, I think, and probably not praise at all, actually. His poems, like McGonagall's, are kind of, completely tone deaf when it comes to composition, when it comes to cadence and so on. One of the shortest excerpts, examples of his genius for bad poetry, if we can call it that, is the four-line poem he wrote to his son, to Alfred Gwyer, which it was included in that 1875 volume, and he appended a note to the poem that said, Alfred, when asking for bread, calls it bar, B-A-A, and water, wa, W-A-A. Which is very charming. His son was 28 at the time. No, presumably his son was very young. And that's important for the poem to understand what he says. So, to Alfred Gwyer, I wish you, Alfred, now a good night. You gives your mother great delight. Don't you wake up and ask for bar, or you'll offend your dad-dad-da.
Oh no!
There are many other examples of his work. You can seek out his poetry online. There are dedicated fans, if that's quite the word for it, out there. So that's Joseph Guire bringing potatoes and poetry together magnificently. Claire, you've got a altogether more recent example.
I have, yeah. Perhaps a spud of a different kind, because this poem is from an incredibly esteemed poet. This is from one of our more recent poet laureates, Andrew Motion. And this poem is perhaps one that Motion does want to forget. It's his rap poem for Prince William's 21st birthday from 2003. And he wrote it as a tribute to the second in line to the throne. And it came out in a really interesting way. I understand it came out, this was the A side, this rap verse, and I will regale you with it in my best rap voice. And then there was a B-side, so it was kind of mimicking vinyl with an A and a B-side, and the B-side was the more traditional verse. But the A-side is this wonderful tribute. So here you go. Better stand back, here's an age attack, but the second in line is dealing with it fine. It's a threshold, a gateway, a landmark birthday. It's a turning of the page, a coming of age. It's a day to celebrate, a destiny, a fate. It's a taking to the wing, a future thing. Better stand back, here's an age attack, but the second in line is dealing with it fine. It's a sign of what's to come, a start and then some. It's a difference growing, a younger sort of knowing. It's a childhood gone, a step towards the crown. It's a trigger of change, a stretching of the range. Better stand back, here's an age attack, but the second in line is dealing with it fine. I think that this is, well, on the one hand I do think this is kind of like dad dancing in verse, but I think that's why it is so bad it's good. This is obviously out there in the world, and one of the things I did when I was looking at this poem was I was looking at some stuff on the BBC News website, because they put up a piece about it and asked for some comments, and there are some wonderful comments, and you can all access this page online. And it starts obviously with Andrew Motion's comment that he said that both poems are meant to suggest that Prince William is a new kind of royal figure, but still faces many of the old pressures and responsibilities. However, some of the other comments were a bit less generous. So Hattie, who's just said has been from England, commented, I think the rap poem thing was really bad. Prince William looks really confused. Another one that just goes by the name of CCC says, God spare us from this tosh. Another one, Charles from Canada, says, Andrew Motion ain't no Slim Shady. However, there are other people that think this is so bad it's good, because Mrs. Robinson commented that I'm 71 years of age and I cannot believe I've been moved to make a comment in this public way. I found the rap poem really, really endearing and embracing of the new multicultural age generation of Prince William. Excellent.
Wow.
So there are other people that do think it's good.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting he uses a rather outdated and sort of older format, the A side and the B side, kind of suggested by...
That's so retro now.
Yeah, well, it is now, but in 2003...
It wasn't quite there. It wasn't quite there. I agree with you, and it is that kind of, it has that, I guess, that ring of slight cringe to it because of that.
Slight cringe.
Slight cringe, yeah. Nice.
But I think, it's interesting about the Poets Laureate that they're a great mine of bad poetry. It's Philip Larkin who turned it down in 1984 when Betjeman died, and he said, good poetry cannot be written to order. And the one great poem that tends to come to people's minds when they're asked to think of a poem that was written by a Poet Laureate for an official kind of occasion, or for an official, to commemorate something, is the Charge of the Light Brigade, Tennyson's poem. But beyond that, it's quite difficult to think. All the poems about royal events and birthdays and weddings, they've not found their way into anthologies, or not the right anthologies. Anyway.
Is there? This might be mythic, but isn't there? There's said to be a kind of curse on the Poet Laureate for that reason. Although one of the comments,
it's all the sherry they're given to drink. I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Someone does actually evoke Tennyson. They do say that they think he would be turning in his grave at this endeavour from Andrew Motion. But obviously he recovered. I guess this is that this isn't very often spoken about as part of his oeuvre, but I don't think there's anything to be ashamed of here.
No, and it's Well, it's enjoyable in its own way, isn't it?
I think so.
Yeah.
He had to go.
For trying. Exactly. Yes, the B-side is more traditional, and it's pretty much the same thing. It is that kind of trying to, like you say, write for an occasion, which isn't easy.
No.
And to mark, young Prince William, who is or was, remains kind of, much loved.
Yeah.
In the country, so no easy task.
No, and I think going back to what we said about breakup poems at the beginning, that a lot of poetry does stem from unhappiness, and, frustration, or tragedy and things like that. There are far fewer happy poems, or great happy poems about happy occasions, than there are classic poems about, heartache and so on.
What will be really interesting is when young Prince George, now Prince William's son, gets to 21, will this make a comeback? And who will the Poet Laureate be then?
Yeah.
And how will they respond? It's no easy task to kind of write the next age 21.
Maybe
they could write poem.
They could write one for him now, couldn't they? In the style of what?
Aguirre. Yes, they could. Or Ambrose Phillips, who was the origin of namby-pamby, because he wrote poems in commemoration of his friends and patrons' children when they were born, and so a lot of his verse is very babyish. And I think it was Henry Carey, who was they were contemporaries of Jonathan Swift and Pope, and I think it's Henry Carey who took Ambrose Phillips and namby-pamby, that's where the phrase comes from, to describe this kind of feeble and childish kind of way of doing something. I think poems about infants, I think, maybe equally as cringy, maybe.
I think that the end of the one you read is quite spectacular. In that respect, I'm not sure that could be equal.
Yeah, at least there weren't any dad-dad-dars. And
because that would have been really awkward, wouldn't it? This one.
Excellent. Well, there are many more enjoyable bad poems out there, so I'm sure we'll be bringing more to you next time.